the Texas Pension Review Board. Before we get started, I'd like to ask all participants who are not speaking to please mute your microphones. And when you do speak, please state your name so we all know who it is that we're hearing from. And since we're all working with this technology, we appreciate your patience and forbearance. If it takes us a little longer to recognize you or if we have technical glitches, please understand we're doing the best we can. And with that, I'd like to ask Ashley to please call the roll of members.
Thank you. Chair Keith Brainerd.
Present.
Marcia Dush.
Present.
Stephanie Leiby.
Present.
Thank you. All members are here and accounted for. Ashley also will provide a list of people who are pre-registered to provide comment during the meeting. Do we have any such persons, Ashley, and would you please call that roll?
Yes. So we do have a participant, Mr. David Stacy, who is pre-registered to provide public comment during that item. You can press *6 to unmute yourself.
David Stacy, present.
Thank you. And then during the further on in the meeting, we have plans and their sponsors who are attending, and I will go through that list as well. And so for Abilene, during a discussion of Abilene Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund, we have Rodney Goodman. Rodney Goodman.
As a reminder, if your name is called, if you could press *6 to unmute your phone and let us know if you're here.
Thank you. Baker Bryant.
Here.
Thank you. Mike Rains. Mindy Patterson.
Here. Here.
Thank you. Brad Heinrichs.
Here.
Thank you. Drew Ballard.
Here.
And for Odessa Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund and City, Jill Jones.
Here.
Thank you. Ben Martz.
Here.
And Seth Bowles.
Here.
Thank you. For Orange Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund and City, Cheryl Zito. John Bilbo. Okay, for San Angelo Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund, Ron Pertouche. Okay. Wichita Falls Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund, Chris Duncan.
Here.
Thank you. Doyle Wood.
Here.
Thank you. And Jessica Williams.
Here.
Thank you. For Austin Firefighters Relief and Retirement Fund, and Bill Stefka.
Here.
Thank you. Premal Amin.
Here.
Thank you. Jeremy Burke. And Chuck Campbell.
Here.
Thank you. And for Irving Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund, Micah Johnson.
Here.
Thank you. And that is our list.
Thank you. As a reminder, please mute your microphone if you are not speaking. I suspect that some of the folks who we did not hear from will join us during the course of the meeting. Next item of business is the minutes of the August 6th, 2020 meeting of this committee. And I would entertain a motion to suspend reading of those minutes.
This is Marcia Dash, so moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion passes unanimously. We will not read the minutes of the meeting. Next item on the agenda is item 5, update on review of funding policy requirements under section 802.2011 and FSRP requirements under sections 802.2015 and 802.2016 of the Government Code, including comments received on funding policy and funding soundness restoration plan requirements, policy objectives and considerations, and also possible recommended changes to statutory requirements. And I would like to call on Michelle Cranes to deliver that report, please. Michelle?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. I plan to give you an overview of where we are with this document today. So as you'll remember, at the last actuarial committee meeting, the committee had coalesced around 10 objectives with possible legislative recommendations for each and asked staff to send it out for public comment. We did that. We found the comments very helpful and are thankful to the commenters. I think it'll be evident as I go through that they added significantly to our understanding of the issues and proposed some novel ways of addressing them. Ashley, if you would go please to the next slide. We've taken the document that you remember from the last meeting and put the comments within it under each section, under each objective, and then you can find the full comments at the end. I want to remind the members that TextPers had sent comments in June, so we've included those in this round as well. And we received comments from El Paso City Plan yesterday and included those. The goal of the committee today would be to provide direction to staff to take back and draft legislative recommendations to bring to the full board in November. And my intention was to present each objective and the comments received and then stop after each one to allow the committee to discuss before moving on to the next, if that pleases the chair.
Michelle, thank you. Appreciate that background. And if it is okay with the committee, what I'd like to do is have Michelle just walk us through each of these objectives. And we can stop at the end of each objective, talk about the issue. And my hope is to vote on these as a single group for all of them after we have heard from all about all 10 objectives. Does that work for the members of the committee?
Yes, this is Marcia.
That's
Okay,
fine
great.
with me as well.
Thank you. So we'll hear Michelle speak on each one, and we'll stop after each one, and we'll talk about it. And we'll talk about what see if we can get a consensus of the committee for each objective, and then we'll hold an official vote after we've heard from all of them. Michelle, thank you. Please proceed.
You're welcome. So objective 1 is easy because there's no action or comments. It was really to establish the intent of the recommendations, and I do think it could be included in, if you'd like, in a statement of intent or a preamble to the legislative package, essentially to say that we hope that the provisions would have the effect of tying the funding policies and Fsrps together in a continuum of funding support. And that's all I have on 1.
Okay. Staff is proposing no legislative or statutory change with regard to item 1. We could conceivably develop a statutory language out of this if anybody sees a need for it, but at the moment there's no proposed change to statute as a result of objective 1. Anybody have anything to add to that?
Marcia, I agree with Michelle's comment that just this statement, to the extent that we are proposing other changes, would be a good introductory statement going forward.
Okay, are you suggesting that that could be a introductory statement in statute or somewhere else?
I would expect that if we're proposing changes to statute, that we would, in a preamble, give an explanation for why we are doing that. And this, I think, forms part of the reason why we're doing it.
Great, thank you for clarifying. So I would ask if staff would make a note of that and bring back, well, we'll vote on it before we leave today. Assuming that it passes, we would ask that staff come back with pertinent language, sort of as an introduction to the FSRP for consideration by the full board at our next meeting. Anything else on objective 1? Michelle, please, on to number 2.
Objective 2 relates to enhancing the sponsor's role in the funding policy and FSRP process. 2A would add the sponsor to the funding policy statute for all plans. 2B would require sponsors of plans subject to FSRP to work together with the plan to revise the funding policy at that point in time. And 2C would require the City Council to adopt the FSRP to enhance full sponsor ownership. We received a number of comments in support of requiring more of the sponsor, including one from a Telfer plan, the first one here, that pointed out that the sponsor can take actions such as decreasing contributions unilaterally and without an actuarial study, which in their case added 17 years to their amortization period. Bringing the sponsor into the funding policy development, one would hope that such scenarios should not happen, as both parties would craft the funding plan together. Overall, commenters found it most effective to add the sponsor to the funding policy development once the plan was subject to FSRP, which is again 2B. And I'll stop there and allow the committee to deliberate if there are no questions.
Okay, so thank you, Michelle. So staff is recommending objectives or changes labeled as 2A, 2B, and 2C. And consistent with the written comments that we received, that staff received, my observation and based on my experience as well, this is one of the more important elements that we're hearing here. And basically, this objective seeks to clarify that plan sponsors, the cities and the state and so forth, are equal partners in these pension plans and need to be treated as such and need to operate as such. And if these objectives were incorporated into statute, it would go a long way to establishing that. So staff has recommended 2A, 2B, and 2C in terms of statutory changes. Comments or questions from the committee, please?
This is Marcia. I would agree with staff recommendations and your comments.
Okay, Michelle, thank you. On to objective 3, please.
Yes. Objective 3, and specifically 3A, would clarify in the funding policy statute that policies must use actuarial methods based on a closed amortization period and thus move towards 100% funding. I believe we'll have some discussion on the rolling ADC benchmarks that were used in a small number of funding policies later in this meeting. We received 2 comments here. one raising objection and the other citing concerns with enforcing it. That's all I had to present on objective 3.
This is Marcia Dash. May I make comments?
Please, Marcia.
So, you know, I really do believe that requiring a funding policy was a great first step. I truly would like to see more down the road. I have already gone on record with my concerns about rolling amortization periods as part of the benchmark. And I do believe that there's also considerable work going on within the actuarial community about funding for public plans with respect to recommendations as to acceptable and unacceptable methods. And I think also our actuarial standards of practice, specifically ASOP 4, would have something to say about reasonable policies, reasonable methods of determining an actuarially developed contribution. I would like to say that I am also aware that there are still some plans that question the intent of the law to say that they should be targeting 100% funding. And I would like to make just a couple comments about why I believe that plans should aim for 100% funding. You know, an unfunded liability is created when benefits that have been earned in prior years are not fully funded as they are earned. This happens when actual investment results are less than what had been expected, or other actuarial assumptions aren't met, or contributions are too small, or benefit increases are granted and are not fully paid for when they're granted. So, but in any case, unfunded liability has to do with benefits being earned in prior years. I think that aiming for fully funding the actuarial liability does 3 things. You know, it goes back to, I think, the principles that we included in our guidance for developing a funding policy. You know, 1, we're trying to ensure benefit security. It's just not fair or feasible for members who have contributed, in most cases, very major amounts from their own paychecks to these plans. It should not be fair that these members run any risk of losing their pensions because the plan isn't funded adequately. Also, by fully funding, aiming to fully fund a plan, you create a more predictable, less volatile contribution set of requirements. Even if you're in a fixed rate plan, you know, if a plan becomes desperately, you know, becomes underfunded against that, you're going to have to increase contributions. So poorly funded plans are the most likely ones to need large contribution increases when actual results are less than what is expected to maintain solvency. This is really important for bond rating agencies as well as for municipal budgeting and planning. And as I said, you know, in the actuarial standards of practice, to the extent that, you know, a contribution scheme isn't expected to pay off the unfunded, it's going to have to be disclosed. And thirdly, it just goes to intergenerational equity. It creates improved equity for taxpayers and members. And as long as there's an unfunded liability, members and or sponsors are paying into the plan to fund benefits that have already been earned, and perhaps not even by current members. So by not funding the liability as it's earned, future members and future tax receipts are being used to pay for services that were provided in the past. And if you have a defined benefit plan and you have agreed to pre-fund it, the commitment is to pay for services and the benefits that are attributable to those services as they're being earned. And so that's just, you know, it goes back to those 3 principles, you know, intergenerational equity, non-volatile contributions, and benefit security as to why you aim for 100%. And so I just wanted to kind of remind everybody that that's what the goal is here. Now, like I said, I am glad that the law has been passed. I personally would like to see more. And down the line, depending on how things go with the funding policies and with our work on the really on the more poorly funded plans through the FSRP rule, I would like us to consider rulemaking, but I'm not proposing that we do that right now.
Thank you, Marcia. And I agree. I think that perhaps repeating what you said differently, both the accounting and the actuarial professions are on record as endorsing those concepts that you identified, including intergenerational equity and the others, and that statute ought to reflect that. I know that there's a strain of thinking out there that there's no compelling reason for public pension plans to necessarily strive toward full funding. I don't happen to subscribe to that. I don't think Texas, as a matter of state policy, should subscribe to that. And I think that the Pension Review Board ought to try to align state statute as much as we are able with the best considered practices of the accounting and the actuarial professions. Staff has recommended no changes on this objective. I would like to suggest a change, and again, we'll vote on all of these collectively at the end, but I would like to suggest a change that would revise this statute to exclude the use of any amortization policies that are not recognized as acceptable practices by the Conference of Consulting Actuaries, and they've got a document. Their Public Plans Committee has a document on acceptable practices with regard to a range of actuarial methods and approaches. And they're very specific about what is acceptable and what they consider to be not recommended and unacceptable practices with regard to amortization policy. And I would like to propose that staff develop language for the full board's approval for amortization policies that would exclude any unacceptable practices, and generally speaking, that excludes most rolling or open amortization methods.
Keith, again, this is Marcia. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was actually going to mention that paper. Again, it is the paper that it's called the Actuarial Funding Policies and Practices for Public Pension Plans, dated from October 2014. I was actually going to comment that if we go to rulemaking, I would like to see the rules that that we would propose be along those lines, because I do think that's a very level-headed paper that I think represents the actuarial community thinking at this point in time, even though it was written several years ago. So I would, if we can get the law to incorporate those rules now, great. Otherwise, I'd like to see it come through rulemaking.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do, and again, we'll vote on all of these at the end, but if there is, if the committee can agree on this, I'd like to ask staff to come back to the full board with an approach, either statutory or rulemaking, on how to reflect those wishes into state policy, please.
Okay, we'll do that.
And also, I'm reminded that we ought to take public comment on these objectives one by one rather than waiting till the entire end. So I'm sorry we got to number 3. What I'd like to do, if there are no other comments from the members of the committee on the first 3 objectives, is give members of the public an opportunity to share their thoughts on any of the first 3 objectives that we've covered. And after this one, we'll stop after each objective and give the public an opportunity to comment. So if you wish to speak to any of these objectives or our statements on these objectives made so far, this would be an appropriate time. And as a reminder, to unmute your microphone, *6.
This is Bill Stefka. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Mr. Stefka. Please.
I know that we have talked to Anu and the staff at the PRB And we are one of the funds that has the rolling or open-ended benchmark. We do use a 30-year benchmark. We do have a funding policy that talks about if it's a certain number of years, if 3 years go by where we're 2% or more less in contributions than where we should be according to the ADC, then it triggers a mechanism where we meet with the city and go to a 20-year plan. The 20-year plan is just I guess an emergency type situation. We hope not to get in that position, but I know that that's a protection measure. Our particular fund, we feel like we have an obligation to our retirees to pay COLAs if they're affordable. In fact, I think we're mandated to do that, but only if it's affordable and we maintain actuarial soundness and financial stability. Our board has taken that responsibility seriously, and they have been able to pay. Our fund has been fortunate enough to be able to pay COLAs for the last 8 years. Our intent, I think the board's intent, is to continue what's in our statute, which is law, and it says that retirees are entitled to these annual COLAs, and we use that as a directive that we try to live by. I don't know if one size fits all on the open, or to say that the open-ended amortization method is not working, it will never get you to 100%. I think if we meet all of our actuarial assumptions, we would be fully funded. We are using the 30-year amortization period, but like you said, we're talking about a while ago, according to the rules from years back, 80% was the target, and I think maybe 30 or 40 years, but we have always taken upon ourselves to try not to go over 25 years after any changes. In the last, in our last actuarial evaluation, 12/31/19, that included the board's decision to lower the price inflation assumption from 2.75 to 2.5%. The payroll growth rate was changed from 3.5 to 2%. The rate of return assumption was lowered from 7.7 to 7.5, and that will continue to be a target to lower as we go forward. It's not going to be a race, it'll be a marathon, but we're working toward lowering that assumed rate of return based on favorable actuarial gains. If we can't afford it, we can't do it. And also this valuation included a 1.7% full inflation COLA for 2020 for our retirees. That matched the CPI-U index that we use. Being 87, after the study was done and after making all those changes, we were 87% funded with a 22-year amortization period. We try to stay above 80, and we try to stay, as far as the funded ratio, and we try to stay under 25 on the amortization period. We don't feel compelled to just go for a 100% overfunded situation and have our retirees pay the price on that as to not getting any COLAs that they're entitled to. So that's kind of a predicament, but we feel like as long as we have our own policy that we stay above 80% and no more than a 25-year amortization period, then we've accomplished something, especially taking care of our retirees. We talk about the three main factors as to what's driving all this is pension contribution stability. We feel like a fixed contribution rate is very much preferred over anything else. It's if it says in state law that so-and-so will pay this or that, then you can pretty well count on it that it's going to happen without going to the legislature. The benefit security, we take that seriously. We're paying pension, not only maintaining that, but paying COLAs on top of that. And the intergovernmental equity, after 2008, our firefighters got together and they decided to shore up the fund. They would pay 3% more in contributions, and they negotiated with the city to give up 4% in pay raises over a number of years. In lieu of that, they would pay the pension contributions, 4% additional pension. So that was a total of 7% additional pay. That was a big step. There were some sacrifices. It gets back to the point that when you're not there, you have to do something about it, either increase contributions or cut benefits. Our firefighters decided that they do not want they do not want to have a two-tiered system. They chose that. They feel like everybody should have the same benefit and everybody should pay in the same amount. And we look at that intergovernmental equity as more on the benefit side. Since we've been in existence for 80 years and it's working, and we're not in any kind of financial straits, so we feel like if it's working, it's not broken for us. Now, maybe not for others, but for us, we feel like we should have that choice until it's mandated by state law or what have you.
Mr.
That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate your comments.
Yes, sir.
And one thing I would point out on the specific issue of the amortization policy is that actuarial profession does not rule out use of any rolling or amortization or open amortization period. They specifically express concern about the use of open amortization periods that are longer than 25 years. And so what I have suggested is that the staff consider incorporating acceptable practices into state law, and from the sound of it, some or all of what you described for your plan would be acceptable if these PRB funding guidelines were to proceed.
Thank you, sir.
And again, we'll be having more discussion, as Michelle indicated, we'll be having more discussion about this issue on a subsequent agenda item.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your comments. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the committee on any of the first three objectives that have been discussed so far? Again, *6 on your phone. Michelle.
Mr. Chairman, this is Brad Heinrichs with Foster & Foster.
Hello, Brad.
Hi there. The one thing I just wanted to make sure that the committee is aware of is that these papers that are being mentioned peripherally or specifically that you're talking about, the CCA white paper, SOA blue ribbon panel, those papers are addressing funding and funding policies and talking about closed versus open amortizations and those kinds of things. I just want to make sure that the committee continues to keep in mind that the funding policy for all of these plans, it's a fixed rate contribution. And so while the CCA white paper may say that they don't necessarily recommend an open amortization period, they're talking about an open amortization period for the purposes of determining annual funding requirements. I'm not talking about a benchmark or a threshold for determining an Fsrp. It's in a completely different context. And I just want to make sure that the board is mindful of that you may be reading a paper that is intended for a specific purpose of developing annual funding requirements. Until the annual funding requirements of these plans are determined on an annual basis, on an actuarial basis, I don't know how applicable some of these papers are, or at least not directly applicable. And I just want to make sure that the committee is mindful of that and is aware of that whenever you make your policy and rules.
Brad, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think that's important context for us to have. This is probably not the best place to have a robust discussion on this issue, but I would say that I think that there are some inherent flaws in relying on a fixed rate funding approach, which much of this state does, and I think the results speak for themselves. And what I'm hoping that the Pension Review Board is able to do through these statutory recommendations, as well as other components that this board gets involved with, is to nudge the state toward a different approach that produces a little bit healthier long-term actuarial funding conditions.
This is Marcia. Keith, I would say it perhaps a little differently, which is I do think that the papers are very helpful in our context of determining benchmarks, because as long as the fixed rate contribution is close to the benchmark, then we can say that we're moving in the right direction. The funding policy, the real important part of the funding policy is, what do you do when the fixed rate contribution is substantially below what the benchmark it would say to be contributing. And that's, to me, that's like a real integral part of the funding policy, which is how do you then, what triggers the need for correction, what triggers the need for actions. And so I still think designing a benchmark along lines of what an ADC plan would be required to contribute is very helpful in our work.
Thank you. And again, I think in a subsequent agenda item, we'll have a chance to explore this issue a little bit further. Was there anything else on item 3 or objective 3 that the committee wishes to share at this time? Michelle, have you covered all of objective 3?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, please on to objective 4.
Okay. Objective 4 and 5 really tie so closely together that I'd like to present the options and comments in 4 and 5 so that you could discuss them together.
Please.
Thank you. Okay, so 4 would lower the FSRP trigger and target amortization period from 40 to 30 years. And I was just reminded during the immediately preceding discussion that all but a small number of plans in their funding policies adopted a closed ADC benchmark of 30 or fewer years. Commenters were generally supportive of lowering the 40 years, but many asked that the FSRP law mirror the PRB's funding guidelines, which were updated in 2017 and allowed systems until 2025 to get down to 30 years as a maximum. Objective 5 was to reduce the time period between hitting the threshold and triggering an FSRP. And in current law, both the trigger for an FSRP and the target the systems must achieve is 40 years. And then they're provided 10 years to reach 40. Staff had presented 2 approaches that would use an immediate trigger for higher risk plans with amortization periods over 40 years, but different triggers between the threshold and 40 years. And we've started referring to that as a tiered trigger approach, just as a manner of shorthand. 5A would maintain the 2 to 3 consecutive valuations to trigger an FSRP for plans between 30 and 40. And 5B would only subject plans that are between 30 and 40 years to an immediate FSRP if their funded ratio was also below 65%. And there's an appendix on page 31 of the packet that shows what would happen if these provisions went into effect today. Several commenters liked the tiered approach, and one preferred 5B in particular, adding the funded ratio as a metric to determine the immediacy of the FSRP requirement for those plans in between 30 and 40. 5C, if we go back, please, Ashley, raised the possibility of setting a lower target than the threshold which triggers the FSRP. And one commenter, Mark Fenlaw with Red and Wisdom, suggested changing the target to 30 years while keeping the trigger at 40, and then maintaining the multiple valuations to get to that trigger. Mr. Fenlaw also suggested removing the 10-year period to achieve a 30-year target amortization period. And Mark has dialed in, I believe, and is available to answer questions regarding his comments. Finally, 5D would allow some consideration for plans that have already adopted structural funding reforms that are based on ADC or a modified type of ADC approach. So I would stop there and be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. This gets complicated, I'm the first to admit. There are a lot of moving parts here, and I think that there are different ways of getting to what I believe there probably is a consensus among most or all on the call to where we want to get. So bear with us as we sort of work through these different moving parts, and we appreciate the comments that have been submitted. If Mark Fenlaw is here, I would invite Mr. Fenlaw to share his thoughts on this subject. Mark, are you there?
Mark Fenlaw.
Hi, welcome. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. The point of asking the committee to consider keeping the multiple valuation trigger is to give boards and their sponsoring employer an opportunity to take corrective action before the FSRP is triggered. In other words, after the first valuation and before the second, to come up with some changes, either an increase in contributions or a change in the benefit formula or a combination that would get them below 30 years. And I think also I didn't really see a requirement that, or a recommendation that the 10-year period to achieve the target be removed, but it seems like that's a fallacy in the current state law to, in effect, say you've only got to get down to 50 years so that you'll be at 40 years in 10 years. So we like the idea of targeting 30 years, but delaying the trigger to leave the multiple valuations as it is currently written.
Thank you. My understanding, and I would ask Michelle to correct me if I'm wrong, but that the staff's recommendation accommodates Mr. Fenlaw's suggestions as well as comments from Texpers and others by keeping the year 2025 as the target date for getting to 30 years. And that roughly gets us to the same place. Michelle, can you comment on that, please?
Yes, sure. I think that could work. So if what you have in mind, Mr. Brainerd, is to adopt some version of 5B, for example, but with two modifications, one being that the immediate triggers, meaning if you're over 40 years or you have a funded ratio below 65%, could not go into effect essentially until 2025 would be one way to do it. But I think more importantly, what I hear you possibly saying is that the target of 30 years would not be required to be achieved in an FSRP until 2025. So even if a system became subject through multiple valuations before 2025 to an FSRP, that its target they would still have until 2025 to get down to 30, which is, I think, nearly exactly what the funding guidelines that were updated in 2017 called for as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So the law would take effect, meaning the threshold is lowered to 30, and all plans in the state would have until 2025 to get to 30 years. So the PRB would continue to abide by the funding guidelines that were approved in, I think, 2017, that have an objective for all plans to be at 30 years by 2025. With and my understanding is that is accomplished through the recommendations that are presented by the staff.
I think we would want to just look and make sure that that's the case and do any updating necessary to bring it to the full board. But I believe that we understand what you're asking for. And I think just for clarification, I'd like to make sure that I understand if you all like the idea of immediate, like a tiered trigger where plans over 40 and or with a low funded ratio might become immediate after 2025. I think those two things are separate.
Michelle, this is Marcia. So I went back, the pension funding guidelines were adopted before I became a member of this board. So I went back and saw that you have published guidelines that say that, plans should hit 30 years by 2025. Preferably, it would have been less than, in the 10 to 25 year range, but not to exceed 30 years. And that was as soon as practicable, but not later than 6/30/2025. So I think what you're trying to do is sew together essentially you've put this out already, and then sew together the Fsrp and the funding policy rules to tie it back to this pension funding guidelines. So I am in agreement that I would like to see the the trigger. I would go with a trigger with that layered trigger, and I'll repeat what my understanding is. And then the Fsrp itself should get people down to 30 years. And the trigger would be something like, if you're over 40, you got to do an Fsrp right away. If you're between 30 and 40, then I like that, you look at the funded status. And if it's below 65%, then you got to do an Fsrp. And then if you are over 30, but not 40, and your funded status isn't a problem, then we can wait the 2 or 3 valuations to see if it was just an aberration, maybe due to a bad market year or something like that. But again, we want to get down to what the guidelines say is the 30 years. Now, I do have one other comment, and this is, again, I'm going to put it out as being something to consider for down the road, not necessarily something to be incorporated at this point. But one of the issues that I have concern about is I believe that the amortization periods can be greatly manipulated by the assumption on payroll growth. And again, I think what I'm saying is I'm kind of willing to see how things play out a little bit. But for those plans that are assuming, 4% payroll growth indefinitely, in order to calculate these amortizations, I would want to see some backup that they've actually experienced 4% payroll growth. I would perhaps want to consider putting some limits on the payroll growth assumption in the future if we really feel as a committee or as the board that assumption is being manipulated, because that has a lot to do with the calculation of the amortization period.
Thank you. Points well taken. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to address objectives 4 and 5? Have we covered objectives 4 and 5 for now?
This is Marcia Dash with one additional comment regarding the table on page 31. If you could put that up, Ashley, please. I don't think the table is maybe titled as clearly as it should be, but these would be plans that are not currently subject to an FSRP that would potentially become subject to an FSRP. There are another 11 plans that are either already subject to an FSRP but haven't submitted it. They're Irving, Midland, Longview, Orange, Marshall, and Beaumont. And plans that have submitted an FSRP but still have an amortization period greater than 40. Fort Worth, Dallas employees, retirement fund, Wichita Falls, Greenville, and Odessa. So I didn't want to give the impression that only the 21 listed here would be in FSRP, but I would expect that those other 11 would continue to be subject to an FSRP. So there would be, I think, 32 plans, or roughly 1/3 of our plans in Texas, subject to this FSRP rule.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Kumar, just to clarify here, this list, we developed this list for informational purposes, assuming that the law became effective next year, right? So if the members are considering to allow the 2025 goal year to stay, it's possible, and we'd hope that this list would be smaller. And the systems are going to actively work towards lowering their amortization period down to 30 by 2025.
Thank you, Anu. That's helpful context. Anything else on objectives 4 and 5, please? If not, on to number 6, please, Michelle.
Okay. Objective 6 seeks clarity in the role of future actions within FSRPs. Again, an example would be if member contribution increases were contingent on a vote of the membership. Staff has not had a lot of guidance on how to handle that. Specifically, 6A would require some documentation of the intent to adopt funding increases or hold member votes. 6B would clarify that assumptions used in the development would have to comply with actuarial standards of practice. And 6C would require the plan and sponsor to update the PRB on whether those actions had occurred within 6 months. For example, if a vote of the membership succeeded or failed. Generally, commenters indicated support for 6B and C, and I'll leave it to the committee for discussion, but just to clarify, we don't view these as mutually exclusive alternatives from which you need to pick. We think they would work together.
Thank you. Comments or questions on this objective or the recommended changes?
I still think all 3 are good objectives. They're good ways of carrying out the objective.
I like them also, and this is another way of getting the plan sponsor to participate in the life of the plan. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to address objective 6? Other comments or questions regarding objective 6? If not, let's move on to objective 7, please.
Sorry about that. 7A, let me take a step back. PRB staff has struggled sometimes to evaluate whether the FSRP would achieve the required amortization period because of the impact of the various changes wasn't clear. The potential change here would clarify and make transparent that the FSRP should be supported by an analysis of the combined effect of the changes, including an actuarial projection showing the unfunded liability decreasing to zero within the required period of time. The comments on 7 really varied from each other, with some support, some indication that it could be an unnecessary expense, and then a suggestion that the sponsor could contribute to the cost of the projection. And that's all I had to say on number 7.
Comments or questions for staff regarding objective 7, staff's proposal, including the possibility that was proposed by one commenter that the cost should be equally shared with the plan sponsor if there is an analysis required. And if nothing from members of the committee, I would invite any members of the public who wish to share their thoughts on this objective and staff's recommendation.
This is Micah Johnson with the Irving Fire.
Welcome, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, this really speaks to item number 2, but dovetails in with all of these. I think that, and we may get into this later when we come to our discussion, but I think it's important to remind the committee that there's no mechanism that requires the plan sponsor to make these ADC contributions. And because there's no teeth involved in making the funding, we can come up when we come up with the FSRP plans, but yet there's no mechanism that actually requires the funding statutorily or through the legislature. It makes the negotiations difficult. I just wanted to bring that to the committee's attention that, and of course, we are knee deep in those negotiations at this time, but it's proven to be very difficult to actually require the funding that's determined by our actuaries.
Mr. Johnson, thank you. Speaking just for myself as one member of the committee and the Pension Review Board, I could not agree more. And that is a governance matter, governance at the state level. I'm not talking about governance in the public pension board sense. I'm talking about governance in the context of the state constitution and the state laws that regulate how public pension plans are funded and measured and reported and so forth. And you have touched on what probably is the single most important reason that many public pension plans in the state of Texas are so poorly funded, and that is that there's no mechanism to replace a commitment to fiscal prudence, and that there's no mechanism to require plan sponsors and plans to come together to make sure that benefits that are being promised are actually paid for. And we appreciate your reminder. We appreciate your being here. And I would remind everybody that we're the Pension Review Board. We review, but we don't have teeth either. But we're doing all that we can, or trying to do all that we can to raise these issues to try to promote sound funding of these promised benefits.
So, Keith, this is Marcia again. So far, our discussion, in item 6, we're saying if you're in an FSRP and it's, in order to meet the goals of the FSRP, you need higher contributions, then we're asking for a resolution from the plan sponsor or the municipal board or whatever, that essentially they go on record saying they're going to pay what is required in the FSRP. So the only place we have put teeth into this so far is if you're in an FSRP. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. So we're getting there, but we still haven't avoided the problem that the gentleman from Irving has commented on.
I agree with that.
Okay.
Other comments or questions regarding objective 7? If not, let's move on to objective 8, please.
Okay. Objective 8 relates to preventing perpetual revised FSRPs by establishing stricter requirements on subsequent FSRPs. I think you'll remember that we found this the most challenging objective to figure out a solution to, and so the commenters provided some interesting discussion. So first, a commenter encouraged the committee to consider looking at adjustable benefit or contribution provisions or other predetermined provisions within the first FSRP that could address future funding shortfalls if the first set of reforms didn't work, and in that sense, reduce the need for a whole new or revised FSRP. Another commenter asked that such options, meaning if stricter standards like risk sharing mechanisms or ADC funding structure were required to be considered in a revised FSRP, that those not be limited but kept broad. Another commenter suggested the legislature should really be the forum to address the issues if a second FSRP, meaning a revised FSRP, doesn't work. And finally, another commenter raised doubt that anything could really be done in cases of inadequate contribution requirements. I'm sorry, I don't have a lot more to give you on this one, but we do take this problem seriously and want to try to find a way that we wouldn't keep ending up with, like, for example, we've discussed a few times that 9 out of the original 12 FSRPs have been required to do revised plans, and one of those is on a second revised. So it seems there's a problem here, and I'll stop and allow you to discuss.
Thank you. So obviously this gets to the issue of there being no mechanism to require that plans be appropriately funded. There is no incentive to require pension boards or plan sponsors to actually implement requirements, at least in the near term, of FSRPs. And as staff mentioned, a majority of plans that have gone into FSRP status have had to go back in. And we're trying to address ways that we might discourage that, and that we might instead get FSRPs that actually produce tangible results. Any comments or questions from members of the committee for staff?
Members, to quickly remind you and potentially consider, under objective 5, when we heard from Mr. Finlaw, one of his comments was regarding the 10-year period that's currently in law that allows systems 10 years to meet the target of 40 years. In his comment, he had suggested to do away with the 10 years. Now, granted, he was talking about keeping the trigger as is, lowering the target down to 30, but then he did say that the 10-year period can be done away with as an option. And if the members wish to go that route, if they would so choose to propose dropping the 10-year period, then to a certain degree, the issue with the revised FSRP that we have under Objective 8 could be resolved.
And this is Marcia. I thought we did discuss that we were going to drop the 10-year, that you've got 10 years to get to 30, because we're really focusing on 2025 as being the aim for 30. I think it does go away. I do think if somebody becomes subject to maybe you get 2 shots under the new rules to get to compliance, but if you don't make it then some stricter rules ought to kick in. And I also think we've got to consider some transitions for plans that are already subject to FSRP. So, you know, I think, I don't know, I think that's something you have to come back to us on with some recommendations here.
Yeah, well, speaking for myself, I support some more stringent guidelines to create an incentive to not have repeat FSRP participants. And also finding a way to accommodate those who already are in FSRP status and giving those FSRP solutions an opportunity to work. And I'm wondering if that's enough guidance for staff, if the committee were to go with that, or do you need more specific details from the committee?
I think that we could work with that. Thank you. And just to maybe clarify, if you all would think it appropriate for us to move forward with something using some of the terms that we had in the document, for example, that a second or third FSRP would need to include some number of risk sharing or adjustable benefit or contribution mechanisms, or contribution structures based on ADC, or a lower amortization period target, such as one within the target range of 10 to 25. If you'd like us to craft something that might list some of those things as options.
Yeah, I think all of those sound appropriate to me.
Okay.
Are there members of the public who wish to address this item? Other comments or questions from the committee? I think the direction we're heading on this is that we've given staff some guidance that we'd like to put into law, propose into law, incentives to avoid multiple visits to the FSRP pool, and also to accommodate plans that already are in FSRP status, recognizing that they may already be moving toward compliance with these standards, and staff will come back to us at the full board level with the details. Everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay. On to objective 9, please.
Thank you. And Ashley, is there any way to make the document any bigger? I've lost my own. Okay, so 9 builds on the previous objective to clarify progress on FSRPs, how that should be demonstrated. And again, here, if the 10 years to achieve the FSRP goes away, I think that this objective could be no longer needed, in the sense that there wouldn't be progress updates as you worked your way over those 10 years. And what we were looking at was that if the 10 years remains in play, that updates to the PRB should occur every 2 years, and that those should be coming from the plan and the sponsor, and include an actuarial projection, again, showing that unfunded liability decreasing to 0 within the required time period, and clarifying that an evaluation alone is not an FSRP update. And I'll stop there. Oh, I'm sorry, the comments. Ashley, could you move down just a little bit? So we saw that 9A would be a better option from El Paso City, and that might be the only, nope, there are more. Okay, so yeah, these ran the gamut a bit, with several commenters suggesting that rather than being on a form developed by the PRB, that these could be included within the valuation, such as a supplementary page to the valuation. So I'll stop there, and again, happy to cover more detail, but I think this one really keys off of what you decide to do with 10 years or not.
All right, Michelle, this is Marcia. Let me clarify then. Are you saying you want updates while the FSRP is in effect? So now let's say, the FSRP, we're not waiting 10 years. You got to come up with your FSRP. You got to start, you got to get it to 30. Are you saying you want updates every 2 years after that? Or are you saying, no, now if we don't have the 10-year waiting period, we don't need this?
I believe that if there's not an implementation period or a waiting period, that updates could go away, unless I'm not thinking something through, and I would ask Anu and Kenny to please join in. But those updates are required in the statute now, based on the idea that we are waiting 10 years to see if the target amortization period is reached, and then using those updates to decide whether a revised FSRP is necessary. So if all of that went away, I think it would essentially work that an FSRP was adopted, would need to show that 30 years would be achieved at implementation, and then subsequent valuations would indicate whether a new FSRP was triggered at some point down the road, and hopefully not, because the first would have achieved the 30 years at that time rather than incrementally over a period of 10 years.
This is Kenny. I'll say that, I think Michelle explained it fairly well. The need for an update is because the goal is to hit something in a future date. And so when you are targeting a 50-year amortization period with the initial FSRP, we need to track to make sure you're still on target to hit 40 within that initial deadline. So if that's no longer the case, I don't think we need specific updates for whether. So I think this issue goes away. It does come back to some degree with what happens how do you illustrate that you achieve the FSRP now, and then what happens with respect to second FSRPs and what additional documentation may be required from that perspective. But in general, the need for updates goes away if you're achieving the goals of the FSRP immediately.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. Other comments from members of the committee or staff with regard to Objective 9?
I guess I'm a little confused then. So if somebody puts in an FSRP, they get their amortization period under 30, and the funding policy now has been incorporated into the FSRP, and they have a funding policy that says they're, moving along, a type of amortization, they've got a benchmark and they're moving along that, and then, the funding policy would state a trigger. Is there a need that there should be more oversight by the PRB for that? Or do we're just watching to see if they ever go back over 30?
I think that's what we're saying, is that we could watch them as we do now with each annual evaluation to assess whether they're still under 30, or if unfortunately things have changed to where a new FSRP would be triggered.
But we're not watching to see whether or not they're really complying with their funding policy. Just like we're not really watching anybody else who's.
Well, there's nothing that we can do about it. There's a little that we can do about it, certainly in the interim.
Okay. All right.
I think.
Yeah.
This is Kenny. I mean, I think the idea here is, and in Mr. Finlaw's recommendation, right, he had suggested that you get to 30 as of the prior evaluation date. And how you illustrate that goes into some of this, right? So if you are providing a complete analysis that incorporates all of the expected changes and illustrating that your new amortization period as of the prior evaluation date is now 30, and presumably you are you've got enough information and enough analysis to illustrate that that's the case with your prospective changes, then that satisfies the FSRP requirement. No, we'll have to think through the timing of when you become subject to a new FSRP in the future based on actual experience, right? So maybe the next valuation following that valuation is the first one in the 2 to 3 valuation cycle, right? So, and if you don't stay under 30 or you hit the new targets that we're talking about implementing, then you become subject to a new FSRP, and that's all. So all of this is kind of tied together. That goes back to, again, the conversation of we no longer have revised FSRPs. We now have the consideration of, okay, you just did an FSRP. We're now 3 years later, and you're subject to one again. Are you subject to more stricter standards? Or, is it 5 years? I mean, obviously 50 years down the road, if you become subject to a second FSRP, that's an unreasonable period of time. But I think that, it is something that needs to be considered is there a period of time where you become subject to a second FSRP from your most recent, are things different for you at that point? So I think that we'll have to think through some of these details as we draft the language for y'all's consideration.
Thank you. At the moment, I'm sensing a sentiment to make no recommendations for statutory changes on this one. I think that the points of the commenters, among others, are well taken. We appreciate those of you who have commented, and that is we can see what's going on with the actuarial evaluations. Other comments from the public? Comments or questions from the committee? If not, on to Objective 10, please.
Objective 10 relates to the time allotted to develop an FSRP. Statute currently allows 6 months, and the commenters were in agreement that more time is needed. Also, Board Chair Leiby had asked at the last meeting what the average time period to receive an FSRP was. We did that research and found that indeed it was a little over a year. Average time for us to receive an FSRP after it was triggered or required. So we included a second option, 10B, which would extend that time frame to 1 year rather than 6 months, and however require an update at 6 months to include a draft plan or even just changes that are being considered, both to ensure that some progress is happening and to be able for the PRB to keep the legislature informed. And that's what I'll stop there.
Thank you. So my understanding is that staff is recommending 10B, 1 year.
I can go with that. This is Marcia.
Comments or questions from the members of the committee? Anybody from the public wish to comment or ask questions?
David Stacy, Midland Fire.
Welcome, Mr. Stacy.
I just want to go on record as this timetable on this FSRP, while from an academic discussion standpoint, it seems like a year's a long time. But when you've got to run a plan, which I do, and I've got some degree of experience doing, and a number of my peers do as well, many of which commented, there are so so many moving parts and so many stakeholders that all have to be herded into the same direction in agreement in order to have a meaningful FSRP. Anybody can go through a desktop exercise and put together something that looks pretty, that at the end of the day may or may not produce the desired result. One of the comments Mr. Finlaw made on one of the deals, it's in the best interest of the plans and the boards to figure out what it takes to have a adequate financial arrangement for the plans. And I think that really needs to be taken to heart by the pension emphasis on review board. And one of the reasons I didn't comment on any of this, because I just flat hadn't had time. This isn't my only job. My primary job, even though I don't get paid for it, is running a pension plan. And the one staff person I have doesn't have time to review all this and then come back to me and say, yeah, I think this is good or bad or whatever. So I think that's another thing that I want to go on record, is that just because you didn't receive a lot of comments on this doesn't mean that there is not a lot of interest or a lot of concern in the pension community about these proposals or the details of these proposals. While I've been a long-standing advocate of the Pension Review Board agency, supporting the staff they needed to carry out their role, I guess the other side of that is that they've got more staff now than they've ever had. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but the result of that is that they've got more people with more time at the direction of the board that says, yeah, we want to look at all this stuff and come up with a bunch of ideas about how we can better review pensions in Texas and put teeth where you have no teeth. I could go on, but I'm sure I've outlived my time. So that's my comments for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stacy. We appreciate your participation and your comments.
Mr. Brainerd, may I make a comment there? This is Marcia Dush. Just a couple of thoughts. I do understand that a year isn't a very long time. But for plans that are not over 40% or over 40-year amortizations, where there wouldn't be an immediate trigger, there is time to see this situation developing. So there, I have two thoughts. One, there is time before the 1 year starts where plans and their sponsors should be starting to think through these things. And the other thing is that the FSRP, my understanding is one of the biggest barriers in getting effective FSRPs designed is that the plan sponsor hasn't been held accountable to participate. And if we, have addressed that, where the plan sponsor now is on the hook to be a full party to the FSRP, that perhaps things wouldn't drag on as long as they have been. So those were my thoughts. And I guess the question is if 1 year isn't good enough, what is the right period of time? You can't tell me that it's got to be 10 years. There's got to be, a point in time where we can say it's reasonable to say that you can get this done in a year or whatever.
I'll accept your question as rhetorical.
Yeah, okay.
And I'd like to, what I'd like to do is walk through quickly what my understanding of the suggested statutory recommendations that this committee is going to make to the full board. and ask staff or my fellow committee members to stop me if you disagree, if I'm getting it wrong, or questions. And then we'll have discussion following that and give the members of the public one more opportunity to share any comments. So according to my score sheet on objective 1, I have no action recommended by staff. On objective 2, staff is recommending and the committee is recommending 2A, B, and C. Objective 3, staff will develop language recommending revised amortization policies that comport with professional actuarial standards, recommended practices recommended by the Actuarial Committee. Objective 4, staff is recommending lowering the FSRP trigger period from 40 to 30 years. That objective ties in closely with objective 5. And staff is recommending a modified version of 5B, specifically for an amortization period of more than 30 years. The FSRP would be triggered after 2 or 3 consecutive valuations. Greater than 30 years, but less than 40 years, immediate FSRP would be triggered if the plan has a funding level of 65% or below, and that would not take effect until 2025. And then if the plan has an amortization period of greater than 40 years, an FSRP would be triggered immediately, but likewise, that would not take effect until 2025. On objective 6, staff is recommending and the committee agreed to 6A, B, and C. On 7, we recommend 7A, modified to require the plan and a sponsor to share in the cost of any analysis that's required. On objective 8, that would not take effect until 2025. And then once a plan and sponsor develop their first FSRP, if the plan became subject again to an FSRP, any subsequent required, sorry, let me back up. We gave staff general guidance on objective 8 to come back with us to create an incentive for plans to comply with the FSRP the first time, while also accommodating plans that are already in FSRP status. And objective number 9, staff is recommending, committee is endorsing 9A and B. And then also on objective 10, staff is recommending 10B. New and Michelle, is that consistent with your understanding?
A clarification, please, and thank you for running through those, Chair Brainerd. On number 5, which also ties in with 8, was the committee indicating support for removing the 10-year period?
Yes.
Okay, so we would put that in with 5.
I agree with
And
that.
I believe we would also make sure that 5 stated that the 30-year goal period would not be expected until 2025, meaning FSRPs triggered between now and then would not be encouraged, but not expected to reach 30 years before 2025, in line with our pension funding guidelines.
I agree with that.
Okay, and finally on 9, which were the updates to progress, if we go ahead and draft a package that removes the 10 years, those updates could go away.
I agree with that. I'm sorry, that's I misstated 9, and that is correct. I didn't make a note of that, but that's correct. What you said, Michelle. Michelle, Anu, are you comfortable with that guidance?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
comments or questions from members of the committee?
This is Marcia with one last question, maybe for Kenny, referencing the table on page 31. Kenny, I just want to be sure we're not missing something. You know, the law focuses on this amortization period, which I have some trepidation about, and we have included now in the layered trigger the 65% funded. Is there any plan? Does this really capture I'm most worried about plans that are poorly funded and trying to beef up funded status. Are there plans that maybe are less than 50% funded that don't show up on either the chart on 31 or in plans that are already subject to FSRP?
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, I did look into that. And based on the most recent information, the 50% mark, we actually, there's only 2 plans that have a funded ratio less than 50% and an amortization period less than 30 right now. Those 2 plans happen to have implemented an actuarially determined contribution within the last couple of years. So their historical amortization periods would have caught them. They would have become subject to FSRP, or actually, I think both of them might have been subject to FSRP in the past. But we do have a handful of plans, maybe 10 or so, that are in the 50 to 65% range, that also have amortization periods below 30. They are looking at some historical amortization periods. They likely would not have been captured by this, but a number of them, if I'm looking at this correctly, it looks like a number of them have implemented actuarial contributions of one type or another in the recent past.
Okay.
So most likely they are captured, but there certainly are a couple of plans who fall around the 60% funded ratio range, and their historical amortization periods are usually in the 20s. And
yeah,
so
because we saw this come up with Paris, Texas, where Paris is very poorly funded. We did an intensive review, and the problem is it never kicked up for an FSRP, even though they're very poorly funded because their amortizations were relatively low. And yet, I personally have a concern about whether or not they're solvent in the long term. So I guess, again, I just want to make sure that we're never just looking at this amortization period as being our only decision on what plans are in trouble. And that's all. I just, I thank you for the research.
Point well taken. One metric by itself is not typically not an adequate measurement of a plan's condition.
Chair Brainerd, may I make one more clarification, please, Michelle Cranes? Thank you. I wanted to make sure, is there also support for 5D, which was to allow some consideration for plans such as Fort Worth employees or Galveston police that have already adopted structural funding reforms based on an ADC or some sort of, like that you have to make up the difference between the actual contribution and the ADC such that they can show they're moving towards no unfunded?
So is that consistent with the concept that plans that are already in FSRP status, accommodations be made for plans that are in FSRP status? Or is that a separate issue?
I think, and Anu and Kenny, please jump in if I'm wrong, but I think you would need this if, I know the committee had expressed previously that, no, I guess Fort Worth did have an FSRP, so they're technically, but would FSRP status, we'd have to figure out how to deal with the plans that are still in 10 years, right? I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud. But the idea being to make sure that a plan such as Fort Worth, which came through and made such structural reforms, was not triggered immediately to have to work on another one.
Yeah, my recollection and understanding of the committee's discussion today was that that the recommendations of this committee to the full board are intended to accommodate plans that have taken measures to get into compliance and give those measures an opportunity to take effect. And I would invite my fellow committee members to correct me or elaborate on that if I've missed it.
I would agree. This is Marcia.
Thank you. Is that sufficient guidance, Michelle?
Yes, thank you. So we'll include some version of 5D as well.
Thank you. Other comments or questions on any of these objectives? Any questions about what we're doing, where we're headed? Members of the public, any final comments or questions before staff goes to work, and we'll see these again at the full board level at our next full board meeting. I would entertain a motion to direct staff to draft potential legislative recommendations incorporating input agreed upon here by the committee for consideration of the full board in our next meeting. Yes, sir.
This is Ron Partouche with the San Angelo Fire Pension. I would like to know what the machinations of the PRB, if there has been a cost-benefit analysis done, because what I've seen in the last 4 years is everything the PRB has done is actually costing our funds to be able to come up with all these reports and answers that you want. And the way we operate is we operate off our actuary every 2 years. If we need to make changes, we make those changes because of what we found out in our last 2 years of discovery. And I don't understand why we just got to keep spending more and more money so that the bureaucracy that is the PRB can, I guess, continue to grow. We would just like to know if there's been a cost-benefit analysis for the money we spend on the PRB through our taxes and for the money we're having to spend individually on these funds. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your comments. Any other comments from the public? If not, again, I would entertain a motion directing staff to draft potential legislative recommendations incorporating input agreed upon by this committee for consideration of the full board at our scheduled November meeting.
So moved.
Seconded.
Been moved and seconded. Further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. And I want to thank staff. There are a lot of pieces here, and we appreciate the detailed explanations, and we appreciate in advance the work you're going to do to implement our wishes. On to the next agenda item, number 6, systems with funding policies that use rolling ADC benchmarking, including, and I'm going to name these off, Abilene Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund, Odessa Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund, Orange Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund, San Angelo Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund, Wichita Falls Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund, and Austin Firefighters Relief and Retirement Fund. And I am addressing those of you who are representatives of those funds. I know that we invited you to attend this meeting. We appreciate your attendance and participation. It would be my preference that we not ask or require each of you to come up and make statements, although any of you are invited to do that. I believe that one thing that you have in common is a consulting actuary, and to the extent that you would permit your consulting actuary to represent you in these discussions, that is fine with me. But again, if you want to address the committee, you are welcome to do so. I'd like to ask Anu, are you going to introduce this item for us?
Members, the committee has been discussing this concern over the last couple of meetings, and we have reached out to the systems as well as their consulting actuary to broach the concern that the committee has raised with regards to the funding policy requirement and the resulting policies that this group of systems have adopted. And the rolling ADC benchmark that of course was discussed previously under objective 3 of the agenda. We, at the last committee meeting, the members expressed their desire to be able to talk to these systems directly and give them an opportunity to express the clarification that the committee has been looking for at this meeting. And so we reached out to them. They all were gracious enough to attend the meeting. You've heard from, of course, Austin Fire under one of the previous agendas. And the idea is to have a discussion and give the systems an opportunity to provide clarification regarding the rolling ADC benchmark concern the committee has before we provide the committee, and then of course ultimately the board's recommendation, or shared the board's recommendation with the legislature. We want to make sure that we have done our due diligence to talk to these systems. So that's the idea behind this agenda item today.
Thank you, Anu. I appreciate that. So to start the discussion, I'd like to invite Mr. Heinrichs to address the committee. Mr. Heinrichs, we'll give you 5 minutes to share your overarching thoughts about this issue, if you'd be kind enough to do that.
I'd be happy to, Mr. Chairman. Rest of the committee, since the last meeting where you guys took issue with the rolling benchmark, I've had many discussions, whether it be over the phone or through email with the actuarial staff or the PRB staff, as well as committee member Dush, who's an actuary on the committee. And I think we achieved several, I won't call them milestones, but we certainly identified points of where we agreed, and then there were actually some points of disagreement. I think the biggest issue that the committee has had with our benchmark is whether it's designed to achieve 100% funding. Well, first of all, and I speak for all 6 clients that chose this rolling benchmark, and saying that this benchmark does achieve 100% funding. If you set a fixed contribution rate and set it equal to this benchmark, as long as we have neutral plan experience over the next 30 years, we will achieve 100% funding. So the board or the committee's concern with regards to achieving 100% funding, we believe, as the actuary for these funds and the funds themselves and their legal counsel, believe that we are compliant with the statute. And if the PRB believes otherwise, they would certainly love to hear from you in writing on that issue. And I believe that committee member Dush understands the math in this and agrees that with my statement there. Where I think we disagree is really what our benchmark states, and whether it's the preference of you guys at the board. We understand that it's not. But let me clarify a couple of points of difference as to why we believe that this makes the most sense for our clients. First of all, a closed amortization benchmark will be flat over time with neutral plan experience. If I go 20 years and have neutral plan experience, that funding benchmark under a closed amortization will achieve the same percentage of payroll contribution rate. Our rolling benchmark will actually be decreasing over time. And I think that generates a problem for trustee member Dush and maybe the rest of you. I actually think that that's a good thing. And the reason is because if, let's say we have 20 years of neutral plan experience and the amortization period in our actuarial evaluation has gotten down to 10 years, and then we have a really bad year or two of investments, the amortization period might go up to 15 or 16 or heck, maybe even 20. Then our funding benchmark, which was flat, has now increased substantially. Well, in that case, it would trigger increased contributions or reduced benefits for these members. And I think that's completely inappropriate. Our funding benchmark would be decreasing, and it might be at, the contribution rate might be substantially less than the benchmark versus what we're actually contributing. The fixed contribution rate isn't going to change no matter what until we have a trigger to change it. So in this case, under a closed benchmark, these plans might be suggested or might be required to increase contributions or reduce benefits, whereas under our benchmark, there would not be a knee-jerk reaction. Requiring these folks to increase contributions or reduce benefits when the amortization period is 15 or 20 years makes no sense to me. And our benchmark would not suggest that. And then finally, what I'll say in concluding my remarks is that I believe that if you're going to have an actuarial evaluation that creates an amortization period and a funding benchmark, then those should tell the same story. Our approach will align the calculation of the amortization period and the funding benchmark. It would be crazy in my mind, to have a funding benchmark that is higher than the fixed contribution rate when your amortization period might be 15 or 20 years. The story would be different. Each metric would be telling a different story and suggesting it would be chaos. The communications would not align. Our funding benchmark and the amortization period would be telling the same story. And for those reasons, we believe that this is the best and most appropriate approach for the clients that you reference. As I mentioned earlier in the meeting, we're not setting contribution rates using this rolling benchmark. All we're doing is creating a metric, a benchmark to tell a story, to tell these clients, tell these funds whether they're on the right track or not. And I know that you guys may or may not disagree. We believe that we're compliant with the statute, and this is in the best interest of our clients. I guess I'll just stop there and catch my breath and let you guys beat me up if you want.
No, there's not going to be any beating up. We appreciate you being here, Brad. We appreciate your comments, and I appreciate your interest and passion. I'd like to give Marcia Dush an opportunity to share any comments or questions that she might have, please.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was muted there. So I agree with Brad that if you have neutral plan experience, meaning gains and losses offset over time, setting a 30-year rolling benchmark, if your initial contribution is set according to that initial 30-year amortization, a normal cost plus amortization, that you will pay off your unfunded. But to me, the purpose of a funding policy is not only to set that initial goal, but also figure out how you're going to deal particularly with adverse results. And so to me, the benchmark contribution rate is what triggers, is used to say, hey, we got to make a change. And I just believe that when you're using a 30-year rolling benchmark, you're kicking the can too far down the road if, in fact, you're using that to trigger changes. So again, Brad and I have had a discussion about the closed benchmark. And when you get down to 10 or 15 years and you have a bad asset result, it could in fact change the benchmark very significantly. But again, I think everything we've talked about, has some smoothing mechanisms. So first of all, most valuations are smoothing their actuarial value of assets to smooth in gains or losses over a period of 5 years. Not every plan, but my understanding is most plans in Texas use that. And we've also, even within the funding policies, most plans say, you got to have a bad result for 2 or 3 years, and hopefully experience will level out over that. So it wouldn't necessarily trigger an immediate change to the fixed rate contribution. So I just feel that the rolling amortization doesn't do a good enough job to inform plan sponsors. A 30-year rolling amortization doesn't do a good enough job of telling plan sponsors that, hey, something is changing and you need to take action. So again, we've agreed to disagree on that point.
Marcia, thank you. Brad, do you have concerns or objections with a rolling amortization period permissible for periods less than 25 years?
Are you suggesting that, are we talking about setting contribution rates or setting benchmarks?
Contribution rates.
Yeah, I am not a huge fan of the rolling amortization period in setting contribution rates necessarily, but if we're going to pick a rolling, if we're going to pick a number of years, say it's 15, 20, 25, whatever the number is, I would certainly want to pick a number that is probably less than 25 years if I was picking a rolling amortization approach to setting contributions.
Thank you. I appreciate that response. I think one of the issues, again, to me, and we might be into the realm of the philosophical, so bear with me, but I think part of the problem, the underlying problem here, as with many of the challenges facing public pension plans in the state of Texas, is again one of governance. And that is, generally speaking, for most plans in this state, there is no mechanism to force either an adjustment in benefits or an adjustment in funding or contribution rates. And unfortunately, benefits can go off on one track into perpetuity, or at least for a long time, and the same with funding or contribution rates. And for a long period of time, never the twain will meet. Well, eventually they've got to come together because you can't pay more than you've got. And one thing that this committee and this board is about is trying to align benefits that are being promised with funding. And it seems to me, and perhaps to the other members of the committee, that allowing amortization periods that are rolling or open over long periods of time exacerbate rather than resolve that fundamental problem with governance in the plan structure. Do you have a comment about that?
I do, and I agree with you that governance is one of the bigger issues that really face these TELFRA plans. If you heard Micah's comments earlier from Irving Fire, when he was talking about, you guys can do what you want, but it's real difficult to force anything on anybody. That is a real issue. I've got clients now that go to the members and say, okay, we're either going to need to increase contributions or reduce benefits. And the way that the statute reads, according to their attorney, the ballot looks like this. Would you like to increase contributions, reduce benefits, or C, none of the above? And would you believe that when the votes happen, none of the above is a very popular answer, and so nothing gets changed. And so we can have benchmarks, we can have policies, FSRP triggers, but if nothing is, if there's no teeth to anything, then we're kind of wasting our time here. One thing that Ms. Dush mentioned early in the discussion on the other topic that I think needs to also be brought up again, and this is inherent in our clients' benchmarks, is that our payroll growth assumption that we're using for our clients for purpose of the benchmark is lower, and it's actually capped at the average over the last 10 years. And so one of the things that we noticed when we took over a lot of these plans is that payroll growth rates of 4% or 4.5% were very prevalent, and that those rates didn't happen. And so we've been getting real with our clients in adjusting assumptions. And what has that done? That's increased contribution rate, or not increased contribution rates, it's increased amortization periods, and has caused these guys to have to really take a strong look at making changes. But so you're right, you've got a governance issue. There's been a historical assumptions issue with some of these plans. But all told, I believe that from what I can tell, a lot across the state of Texas with these fire plans, we are moving in the right direction. The actuaries work that are advising these plans are now giving sound advice and lowering assumed rates of return, becoming more realistic with payroll growth, and advising these plans to make sure that these benefits are affordable given their contribution rates. I would tell you that almost every one of our funds have done one of the two, either increased contributions, reduced benefits, or both. And my concern is that at some point, these guys are going to feel like their plans are being gutted. And I just want to make sure that we don't go too far.
I appreciate that, Brad. And I have every reason to believe that you and your actuarial colleagues are operating in good faith. I certainly have seen movement toward more realistic actuarial methods and assumptions over the last few years. And I think that's really an encouraging change. But a lot of this, again, gets back to governance. And I'm hoping that eventually the state will make needed adjustments that accomplish a couple of objectives. One of which is to align funding with benefit levels. But a second and equally important, if not more important one, is to make sure that benefits that have been promised are going to be able to be paid, because those to me are fundamental.
This is Marcia. If you would allow me, I would like to make a couple of suggested comments on each of the plans. Just things, if I could, I would just like to go on record on the things that concern me. Brad and I have had some general discussions, but there are a couple of things that when I look at the actuarial results for these plans, they strike me. And I also have some compliments, because I do see that some positive changes have been happening. So if you would indulge me for a minute, and then please, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. So with respect to Abilene, the first thing that I would say is, the last information that I have is that you have an effective amortization period of about 31 years. However, Kenny is still waiting for some information, I believe, from your actuary in order to kind of review that before he publishes this on the website. The Abilene plan is under 50% funded. But I do see that in recent years, contributions have gone up a total of 4% per year. So, it looks like Abilene has taken some very positive steps toward dealing with its funding issue. The only question, and frankly, this is a comment I would make to all of the plans that are here today, which is that each of you are using a discount rate of 7.5% or greater. And I think with the exception of Wichita Falls and San Angelo, over the last 10 years, through a great bull market, none of you has achieved in Austin, so 3 of the 6 have achieved something that matches that rate over the great bull market. But it concerns me greatly that in such a low interest environment that you're using that, especially with most of the fact Abilene has almost a 6% negative non-investment cash flow. So you've got a lot of money going out the door to pay benefits already. So again, the 7.5% interest rate, knowing that you came down from 8, but the 7.5% interest rate does frighten me that that you've got a situation where for at least the next decade, you're probably going to be running investment losses, and so you're not in a unbiased environment. So again, I don't know what your asset allocation is. I don't know what your investment consultants are saying. I hope that when you're setting these expected rates of return on assets, your discount rate, you're taking into account your negative cash flow. And like I say, but I do see that you've made a positive change on your contributions. With respect to Austin, Mr. Stefka, I listened to your comments. I know that you've done quite a bit, and you're in the best shape of all of these 6 plans with a very good funded ratio. My one concern is that you referenced this in your comments. You do have a strong commitment. In fact, it's in your plan document, in your legislation, that you give cost of living increases. But I don't see a cost of living increase assumption in your actuarial report. And you do have an assumption as to what inflation is of, I believe your last CAFR said something like 2.5%. And so I do think that perhaps your actuarial results are somewhat understated, that your liabilities are a little higher, because I do think you should at least be disclosing why you're not making an assumption on the cost of living adjustment, since you do have a regular pattern of providing those adjustments. But I still think you're in good position. But I do think that you should be disclosing more with respect to the cost of living. On Odessa, again, we've had Odessa through a intensive review. If there is somebody from Odessa listening in, I know that the last time in my notes we talked that Odessa was considering some substantial plan changes back in October a year ago. And I wonder if those plan changes have been approved, or whether they, as Brad said, none of the above went through. Is there somebody on the phone from Odessa?
Yes, ma'am. This is James Marks from Odessa.
Okay. Have you been able to get plan changes?
Well, I don't recall us ever having a discussion on plan changes other than the changes we did 1/1/17. The last thing we discussed with y'all was our fire chief coming down and visiting with y'all about the addition of 2 new stations and 40 new personnel.
Okay. Oh, I do apologize. My arrow was to orange rather than Odessa. And I do see that Odessa has upped its contribution. So, but I do remember about Odessa that you do take into account the fact that you were essentially hiring, making a very substantial increase in the number of active firefighters. And I believe your last valuation showed you were up to 166 firefighters. Are you still on track to add all of the firefighters that you had projected?
Yes, ma'am. As of today, we're up to 202.
Wow. You're up to 202 actives. Wow. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Well, then that's going to be a huge help to you. And I know things have not been easy in the economy in Odessa. So that is going to be a great help. And again, you know, your funded percentage is low, but again, you're up 4% on employee contributions. So again, making some positive changes there. So my next comment is with respect to Orange. Now, Orange is perhaps the smallest fund here. My concern with Orange is the low funded ratio. And again, the last comment I saw, I made a comment that there were plan changes being considered in October of 19. So if there's somebody on the phone from Odessa, can you update me on what's going on there?
Orange, anybody from Orange available?
Orange, I'm sorry, not Odessa, Orange, I'm sorry. Okay, so.
Marcia,
yeah.
I'm not sure if anybody from Orange is on. I thought they were going to be attending, but I can give you a little bit of an update.
Yeah.
My understanding is that they continue to be in negotiations. I think that the city agreed to go up by 2% in their contributions.
Okay.
And I think the members were also going to go up by maybe a half a percent or 1%. I'm not sure exactly what they settled on, but there has been some progress made in Orange in terms of increasing the contributions into the fund. As far as any benefit changes, I don't believe that there have been any of those agreed to yet. So in terms of kind of sort of closing their gap, so to speak, I think they're around halfway there. So, but they've at least agreed to some improvements. So.
Yeah. They're the one that has an infinite amortization period out of all of the 6. So, you know, they're the ones that I would be very concerned about. And unfortunately, they're the ones where their employees are already paying more than the normal cost of their plan. So all of the employer contribution is essentially going to pay for their unfunded liabilities. And again, I view that as a huge concern when employees are paying more than the cost of their own benefit.
Understood, Marcia. I think this is a classic case of what Keith was talking about earlier with regards to a governance issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is John Bilbo with the City of Orange.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we've been listening. We're having some technical difficulties on this end, but thank y'all for not talking too bad about us, thinking that we weren't here. But just to catch you up, right now we're in the middle of a 3-day vote to accept a contract through the city, where the city will be kicking in an additional 3%, and the firefighters are going to kick in 1% into the pension, and then we'll get a 1% raise. So that's where we're at right now with no other benefit changes.
Well, that again, a 4% increase in contributions would be a good step forward. And again, you know, I will make one other comment, and I think this came up in the intensive review, that the last information I have, which is probably dated, well, it's 12/31/19. You're still paying a lot for investment expenses, recognizing the relatively small plan, but I still would have concern that you're losing 1% on your assets each year in investment expenses. So
now we just excuse me, but we made the change from Greystone over to Anco.
Okay.
So that's, yeah, we've rectified that problem.
Okay, well, that's good to know then. All right.
Yeah, we have a lot of positives working for us right now. We're headed in the right direction. I do believe them.
Okay.
Marcia, do you have other comments?
Really, you know, nothing particularly on San Angelo. I know that they've increased employee contributions. I'm concerned about a 7.8 discount rate. They did come down from 7.9, but again, On Wichita Falls, and again, I know that Brad mentioned for the benchmark, you're using a 2% growth rate, but what you're disclosing in your actuarial valuation for Wichita Falls for payroll growth is 4%. Again, I haven't looked into the demographics of Wichita Falls, whether you're a growing community, whether you're stable, whatever. It just seems that the 4% payroll growth is high. And again, on Wichita Falls, very substantial negative non-investment cash flow, which should be taken into account when determining the discount rate, which you're at 775, which is the latest information I have there. So again, those pieces do concern me. But let's see, I do believe you've gone up. You've gone up a little bit on an employer contribution, just a tinge, but not much. So those are the things that when I'm looking at the stuff that Kenny provides at each valuation rate, each valuation, those are the things that concern me. I just want to be sure that the benefits get funded so that that no member goes without a pension benefit or no member has to suffer a reduced pension benefit. That's really all I care about. I just want to get these benefits funded, and I want to make sure it's fair to both the taxpayer and the member. I'd love to get to the point where employees didn't have to pay almost the full cost of their benefit.
Yep, thank you for your comments, and I completely agree. Brad, was there something that you wanted to add?
I was just saying that I think our interests are aligned, and certainly with that last comment, Marcia.
Okay.
I agree with that.
Thank you.
Marcia, thank you. We appreciate your observations. Now I want to extend an offer to any of the plans to which Brad is the consulting actuary who are on the call today. If you'd like to share any thoughts, this would be an appropriate time, please. If you wish to do so, please hit *6 and introduce yourself.
This is Jessica Williams, City of Wichita Falls.
And Ms. Williams.
Thank you. These comments have been great today. We've gone over quite a few things. In Wichita Falls in particular, I don't believe that what y'all have may be our most recent valuation. Brad may be able to help me a bit with that because we have decreased our payroll expectations. We've also made changes with our benefits. And one of the challenges that y'all have discussed is the governance of these plans. Coming from both the city side and the pension plan side. Our plan in particular, for any changes to benefit, there has to be a vote by membership. When you go forward and ask members to reduce their benefits, that's a difficult task to achieve. And from the city side, when we're working through looking at where our budgets are at and how these plans have worked, how these benefits have been, promised in the past, there's definitely challenges there that I think really statutorily are going to have to be looked at before we're going to see a lot of long-term benefit. I know that our couple other folks from our pension are here. I didn't know if anyone else from Wichita Falls had comments.
Yeah, this is Ray Wood with Wichita Falls. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Okay. Well, I've been listening for a while, and we've made a few changes. I think I read some of the back and forth emails from Foster and Foster with Marcia, and some of her comments about the rolling benchmark versus the closed benchmark. But just want to assure her that our goal as a board is to as we get closer to the under 30 years of amortization is to start lowering some of our assumptions before we would ever try to lower any contributions or anything. And on another side note on that, the city of Wichita Falls just increased their contributions to some of the employees' pension fund but did not quite fully match that to the fire departments. And they've already decided that, or have made some comments that they're going to they're going to work towards that to get us caught up with the latest, I guess, boost to their contributions. So I think we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah.
Thank you. Marcia?
Yeah, you know, my comment on the Wichita Falls, the information I have is that you're at about 57% funded. So you know you're better than some, but you got a long way to go. And I do think that there's got to be something done with respect to either contributions or benefits. You know, it's one or the other. And I'm looking at my information here. Again, you're pretty close. Your employees are pretty much paying the full cost of their benefits. So everything that the city is kicking in is really going to pay for losses attributable to the past. And again, you know, and I'm sure Brad is, you know, as your actuary is giving you this song and dance, but it's, you know, the sooner you can get to realistic assumptions, you know, then you stop digging the hole, because to the extent that you are expecting, you know, 7 3/4% returns every year, and you're getting 6 or nothing this year, maybe, you dig a bigger hole with respect to your unfunded. And so, you know, my attitude is, you know, face the music, you know, get the numbers on the table, get a realistic liability on the table, and then figure out how to fund it. You know, that's my concern about, you know, Brad and I kept talking about, well, if you have neutral gains and losses offset or no gains or losses, that's great. But when right now, you know, we're not even predicting, you know, equities, you know, global equities to earn 7 or 8% for the next many years. You know, I just have a hard time understanding how you think you're going to get 7 3/4. And again, Wichita Falls is a fairly mature group. You know, you got negative cash flow on the non-investment cash flow. I would just really caution you as to how you're setting that assumption.
Okay, I want to keep our comments focused on the rolling amortization issue, which is the agenda item that we're on. Brad, I know your name was invoked. I'll give you one other opportunity to defend your honor.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I think I've said what I wanted to say. Your guys' comments are well taken, and Marcia and I have had lengthy discussions offline since the last meeting with regards to assumptions and methods and what have you. And I think she's aware that in every single case that we're talking about here, you know, we've become a lot more, after inheriting these funds, we've become a lot more conservative in our assumption making. And in any event, all these plans are on the right track. Yes, they are to some level, depending on which ones we're talking about, they are a little bit of ways away from where they want to be. But I do not believe that this rolling benchmark is inappropriate. And I know that Marcia and I agree to disagree. But it's certainly, even if we agree to disagree that it's the best or not the best, I think that we do agree that if I set the fixed contribution rate equal to the rolling benchmark number, and we have neutral plan experience, that the plan will become 100% funded, which seems to be the intent of the statute. And so we fully believe that we comply with the statute, and that's the most important thing here. The rest of it we can agree to disagree on.
Thank you. Any other fund on the line that wishes to address the committee at this time? Thank you. So we are not slated for action. Yep.
If yes. I may, Corey Word, Financial Firefighters Relief and Retirement. With respect to the membership, I can assure you that 4 out of the 7 members of this board are the most concerned with the performance of our pension fund. There is no one else that is involved with this fund that has any more responsibility or is more worried about this fund and the health of this fund than the board that is present at this time. So that's really all I really got to say. I think I mirror a lot of the comments that Brad has to say or has said, and would just like to shore up what he's been saying.
Thank you very much. I appreciate saying that. Thank you.
Mr. Brainerd, this is James Martins, Odessa.
Welcome, sir.
I just wanted to kind of throw in our 2 cents. We appreciate the mission of the PRB and everything that y'all are attempting to accomplish through all that you do. But to be completely honest with your committee and your full board, y'all are wearing us out. 4 years ago, we came up with 24% of pay in one membership vote, 17% of pay in benefit reductions, 7% of pay in contribution increases. And, you know, we were given the opportunity to do an Fsrp, which was brand new. No one had ever done it. And it's a little frustrating to be here 4 years later, trying to reinvent the thing that we still haven't even finished from the first time you gave it to us. I guess what we're asking here is give us a minute. I mean, we're here talking to you because we care. We're not avoiding this. We're not trying to hide our heads in the sand. We're actively here engaging with you and engaging with our membership. But sometimes it feels like when y'all are sitting in Austin at your desk, you forget the faces that are tied to these decisions, these legislative proposals, and eventually these laws that may get passed. You know, when we have to go to 200 members and ask them to pay more money or get less in their retirement years, that's very hard, but we do it, and we do it to be healthy, and we do it at the direction of the policies that y'all have put before us. So I guess I just want to ask that give us a minute. Okay, let us work on this. It just feels like we're constantly reinventing the wheel here, and it can get a little frustrating at the local level.
That's helpful feedback. We appreciate hearing it. Thank you.
This is Jessica Williams, City of Wichita Falls. I just want to make a couple of last comments. Really a bit of what Odessa has just mentioned. Our boards do care about these funds. And as the CFO for the City of Wichita Falls, I can tell you that our executive management also cares about our fund. And we are working toward change, but we also know that pension is a long-term game. You know, we're looking at the long term, and we're looking at what's happened in 40 and 50 years in the past. So, you know, rest assured that we are working with y'all. We're doing our very best to stay on top of this, and we are making changes. We do care. Our executive leadership cares, and the board as well.
Thank you. We appreciate that feedback. I certainly take it to heart.
Baker Bryant, Abilene Fire Pension. I would like to just chime in from what Odessa and the other comments have said, that as the historically the PRB and the administration has given us guidance to acquire fiduciary professional services and to rely on those advice of those that we employ, and to think that to follow your legislation, as someone else commented, it seems like it's always a moving target. It never we don't know where it's going to stop, and so the continued of more and more requirements and whatnot. I understand that y'all are. I do believe that y'all have the best interest of the beneficiaries in heart, but I want you to understand that all of these boards have those same goals at heart. And I know that in Abilene, we've made some benefit changes. We have a good working relationship with our city, and we've made contribution changes on both the city side and the firefighter side. But to backbone on what the last person just said, it's a long-term goal. And And if changes continue to come upon us in a rapid rate, we can't catch up. We can't ever decide what is actually the target where we're headed to. And I think we all have the same goal in mind, and that's to pay members benefits. And I mean, that's the ultimate goal of everybody involved. And so just don't lose the fact that that's what everybody is trying to do.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback. And I'm certain I can speak for my fellow committee members as well. That's very helpful to hear. I hear you. Anyone else wish to address the committee at this time? If not, I believe the next item on the agenda is a discussion of the date and location of future PRB meetings.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to quickly clarify to make sure we are all on the same page. With regards to these systems, they've provided funding policies as contemplated by the statute. So we are not reporting them as non-compliant to the legislature. And I just wanted to make sure that's clear as we move forward.
Yep, I agree with that. We are not reporting anybody as non-compliant. That's not a determination that has been made, and that's not our intention to convey that sentiment. Thank you. Anu, anything to discuss on date and location of future PRB meetings?
With regards to the actuarial committee meeting, we do not have one scheduled, but Mr. Chairman, I do believe we have 7A, an update from Irving, if they're still around, before we move on.
Yep, thank you.
This is Micah with Irving Fire. I'd be happy to provide you with an update.
Yeah, can you repeat your name, please?
This is Micah Johnson. I'm the chairman for the Irving Fireman's Pension Fund.
Welcome, Mr. Johnson. Please.
I'd just like to start off. Mr. Heinrichs is also our actuary, and so he can answer some of these more detailed questions if they come up. In fact, towards the end, I'd like to hand it over to him to sort of fill in some of the space that I might not have touched on. First, I just want to thank the committee for allowing a little extra time. I know you requested that we provide an update last month, but we have been very busy just this month alone. I can go into as much detail as you like, but some of the delays sort of get a little political as we work through this process with budgeting and how long that takes. But regardless, we have made many changes. I'll just start off with, I know that we're due for an FSRP. One of the things that our fund has been doing is tackling some of the problems that have been sort of delayed for a while regarding our assumptions. As you know, we at one time had one of the largest assumed rate of return or discount rates at 8.25. Our current discount rate that we've adopted is 7%. Now we did that in stair steps down to 7.5, but our assumed rate of return is now at 7. And we also lowered our payroll growth assumption down to 2.75. We tried to use the data-driven approach to come to those conclusions, but as you guys are very well aware of, by doing that, it really does nothing but require an increased contribution or cut in benefit to our plan. And so that's where some of the other members have spoken to, trying to not do it all at once. I know that's debatable, but that would just sort of start off the process of how we've got to some of these numbers that you'll be hearing later. The thing that we have done this month, that the reason why I asked for the delay in this update for you guys, is in negotiating with the city and trying to cover the deficit, which Brad determined to be 7.93% of payroll funding. That was essentially the hole we were trying to fill. In negotiating with the city to come up with that through the last budget year, the city was really not wanting to amend their budget for last year, which put it to October of this year. And so we worked through the year educating the city council on our plan, and we did have some favorable city council, but we also had some opposition, and essentially we were told that they were not going to contribute to the plan unless the firemen made a move. And so as the chair, I took that as we went to the membership, we educated the membership on what the situation was. We came up with a plan that essentially lowered the benefits to the members. We had 3 items that we voted on, and one of those items we addressed several issues with it. That one is the interest on our drop. As you know, we pay an interest to our drop accounts. And one of the previous recommendations of the PRB was that our drop fund was getting too large as a percentage of our total fund. And so by lowering the interest that we paid, we were paying 2% below the assumed rate of return. We lowered that to 3.3. And we also instituted a mechanism to where once you retire from the fire department, we no longer pay interest. So essentially we are getting out of the drop business once you leave the department. And then along with that, we instituted a mechanism using IRS guidelines that once you reach age 70, you'll no longer receive interest on your drop, so that slowly over time, we can get out of paying interest. That one item alone saved us 0.3% of funding. And like I said, Brad can speak on that later as well. The other item that the membership voted in was to raise our average salary that determines our annuity from 3 years to 5 years. And that item saved us 0.67%. And then we also instituted a tier 2 in the plan. As you know, this was it wasn't an easy thing to do. It was very difficult, and a lot of education came along with this, but all of those things together provided enough savings that when we took that to the city council, as recently as this month, then actually voted to increase the contributions to our plan of 3.5%. So when you add those 2 items together, we have come up with 6.44 of the 7.93. All of this has just happened within the last few weeks. Some other background information, and I know that you've been aware of it in the past, but we've made so many changes, and y'all are dealing with so many plans. We have hired Brad with Foster & Foster, and we are working with a new financial consultant, Makita. We have done a lot of work in working through these issues as far as liquidity issues with the interest on the drop, and some of the reasons why we didn't pay different rates of interest and so forth. So we have been working very closely with Brad in formulating these plans and running different studies and what we thought that the membership could vote for. I know I mentioned this earlier, and it seems, and I'll just go ahead and mention it again before I turn it over, but the big pink elephant in the room that keeps getting mentioned is the governance and the legislative requirement of funding these plans. One of the things that's been eye-opening as we work through this process is that, again, we can come up with an agreement, and all of these cities that are on here listening, each city council is having to make these votes to fund these plans. And I know for me, it was sort of eye-opening. For example, our city pays into, for the other employees, they pay into TMRS, and in that plan, the ADC is a requirement. There is no, should we pay it? Should we delay it? You pay it or you're not in it. And I bring that up just to say that although we've made a lot of progress, and we're hoping to continue to have a good relationship with the city council as we move forward to close these gaps, I'm just going to take the opportunity to again bring it to your attention to maybe press the legislature to somehow or another require these funds to be given to the plans, because it's it becomes an item of contention and something that's very difficult to work around. At that point, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have specifically and/or turn it over to Brad to fill in the gaps.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And I'm really encouraged to hear about the progress that's been made there. Thanks for sharing that with us. Comments from the committee, questions for Mr. Johnson?
This is Marcia. I really appreciate what you've gone through. And again, you know, to kind of go back to what I said, you essentially by going to more conservative assumptions, realistic to what the market, you know, may give us over the near term, you stopped digging the hole. So you did all these changes, kind of understanding based on a realistic estimate of what your liabilities are. And therefore you don't have to go, hopefully you won't have to go back, you know, begging for more down the road, because you've set these changes based on realistic assumptions. So I really do appreciate that. And also, yeah, the drop was, I think, a big issue. And it sounds like you've really done a great deal there. Again, I applaud what Irving's done.
Thank you, Marcia. Brad, you are the consulting actuary. If you'd like to make a comment with regard to Irving, we would welcome that.
I'll try to be brief. Yeah, so the group's been great to work with. As you can imagine, when you take over a new fund and you have interest rates or assumed rates of return in 8.25 range and payroll growth at 3.5, and then you look at the historical results and you see that they're not coming anywhere near that. We did an experience study, and we exercised some pretty straight talk with the board, and the board was really, really receptive. They wanted to understand what the real hole, or what the real, what the gap was that they really needed to try to fill. And they chose what I think were reasonable assumptions after the experience study. And then we looked at benefit cuts and contribution increases and showed them all different options of things that they could do. They went to their membership and ultimately decided upon 3 different options to nearly close the entire gap when you include the city's help. So I think the board, like many of these other clients, are really going about this the right way, and I'm encouraged to be a part of it.
Thank you, Brad. And I'm encouraged to hear it. We appreciate your thoughts and your efforts there. Other questions or comments for Irving or their consulting actuary, Mr. Heinrichs? Mr. Johnson, thank you, and please pass on our gratitude to your colleagues as well on the board and at the city. We appreciate especially hearing what is a good news update that we don't get every time. We appreciate hearing that, and thank you, Brad. Anu, you have guidance with regard to Longview?
Members, thank you. They were unable to make it to this meeting. It's my understanding that they're gonna try to come to the November board meeting. So I'll keep you all posted on that.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I got ahead of ourselves on the agenda. Now we're on to agenda item 8, date and location of future PRB meetings.
Yep.
And no committee meeting scheduled for this time. Remind me of the full board meeting. Is that in November?
It's on November 12th, members.
Thank you. We already have had a fairly robust public comment period, but I want to extend one more opportunity for anybody from the public who wishes to address the committee. This would be your opportunity.
David Stacy, Midland Fire.
Welcome, Mr. Stacy. You have the floor.
I want to summarize that.
David, I think you hit the mute button. There you go.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right. I'd like to summarize the context of what you don't hear and the context of the analysis of the numbers that you're given, the numbers that staff uses, and the world that you see based on what you have available to see. It's a static world. And I communicate with most of my peers. Unfortunately, this year has been a really messed up year. But for a long time, I communicate regularly with my peers. And in fact, I've had the opportunity to continue to communicate with some of my peers, even in this messed up year. The issue that I want to illustrate is that we don't live in a vacuum and we don't live in a static world. And most of my peers in the public pension community in Texas are all actively engaged in striving to improve their actuarial assumptions in order to become what is perceived in the marketplace today as more reasonable actuarial assumptions. That is an ongoing moving target, and most of the public pension plans in Texas are working toward that direction. And when you're reducing interest, reducing your return assumption or your discount rate, or you're working toward a goal of reducing that, and you don't just wake up one day and decide I'm going to reduce my, it's a part of an actuarial evaluation and a discussion that with your actuary and your investment advice that you come up with this plan. So it's a process. It takes time. All of us, well, I can't speak for all of us, but I can speak for most of the public pension plans in Texas are working toward that direction and have been for some time. And we're trying to do it in the world we live in, not in the perfect world we don't live in. And I know Marcia's made reference to get realistic and quit digging the hole. Well, you still live in the world you live in, and you don't go looking for a place to dig a hole just because you hadn't dug a hole lately. So I encourage this committee and subsequently the entire pensionary board to consider the context that most of the pension plans in Texas are continually moving and evolving the direction that you've all espoused you want them to go. And yet the data you're using, the static data that you're using to do myriads of analysis is antiquated and out of date because this is a moving target. And I think you need to keep that in context of your mission to strive to improve pensions in Texas, that pensions in Texas are striving to improve themselves continually.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know that you spend a lot of time working on behalf of your pension board and your membership. And we appreciate your faithful attendance at pension review board meetings and committee meetings. And I appreciate your thoughts and insight. It's helpful. I have benefited from hearing from everybody who's commented from the public today. That is helpful input for me, and I'm sure I speak for my fellow committee members. Thank you. Is there anyone else that wishes to address the committee at this time? If there's no further business, no objection, I would move to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
think I need a second.
Or second.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia, Stephanie. I appreciate it. Thank you, Anu, and your staff.
Thank you,
Appreciate
members.
it.